Hello and welcome to this next lecture in the NPTEL course Machine Learning for Core Engineering Disciplines. In last class we discussed about deep learning and neural networks, and we understood that these are constructs right in machine learning through which data is passed from one layer to the next, passing through input, hidden layers, and finally reaching an output layer where some kind of prediction can be made. We also saw an example of a simple feed forward neural network wherein the data goes in one direction and there is no looping or cycling of the network. We also discussed that there are other types of neural networks like recurrent neural networks wherein there is looping of data, because what happens in the past, for example in a time series data or in a paragraph of text, what is written before affects what is going to happen in the future. So then that introduces some kind of looping of data wherein the information from the previous step as well as the new set of features has to be fed into the neural network, and that led to the discussion of recurrent neural networks. We also discussed about convolutional neural networks which find use in computer vision, video and image processing because they use specific type of layers known as convolution layers, pooling layers and so on and so forth, which allow you to focus on different kind of regions or structures in an image. And finally we discussed about the concept of transformers, which are a different approach to problems involving text, right, wherein you try to understand the relationship between each word in the text. And the real breakthrough which happened with transformers is the parallel processing of data, because recurrent neural networks require you to loop through information. You cannot process all the data or all the words in a paragraph at once, and therefore the introduction of attention mechanisms which are useful in transformers really led to the growth of things like ChatGPT, Gemini and other large language models. So in today's lecture we will go ahead and continue our journey wherein we learn about other types of neural networks. So let us go ahead and get started. So we were talking about the types of neural networks, and this is just a general classification, right. Of course there can be other nuances or other types of neural networks that some would consider to be part of this discussion, and you can always look them up. So far, like I mentioned, we have already discussed the simplest type of neural networks, which are the feed forward neural networks. So these are abbreviated as FFNNs. We have also discussed briefly about recurrent neural networks or RNNs, which are useful for time series data or for text processing or speech processing. The next type of a neural network that we discussed was a convolutional neural network. CNNs, and finally we discussed about transformers, wherein there is something known as attention which tries to find the relationship between different words, right, in a piece of text, for example through the use of variables known as query keys and values, queries, keys and values. So we will discuss that when the time comes. So now we will continue our journey forward. We will look at other types of neural networks which we have not yet studied. So the next type that I want to introduce, the fifth one, is an autoencoder. And if you remember when we were discussing about nonlinear dimensionality reduction, wherein we discussed methods such as TSNE and UMAP, we had mentioned that autoencoders are also a class of nonlinear dimensionality reduction, and we had sort of written down a general structure of an autoencoder wherein there is an encoder network and a decoder network, but in this section of the course we will try to go into autoencoders in a little bit more detail. So autoencoders are basically using a combination of an encoder network, right, which transforms features to a latent space. So, from the feature space you reach a latent space, and a decoder network which converts data in the latent space back to the feature space. So, the encoder network, right, transforms features to a latent space, and the decoder network which converts data from the latent space back to the feature space. Together these form an autoencoder architecture, right. And as you can imagine, this latent space, right, usually has fewer dimensions than the feature space, and therefore the autoencoders find use in nonlinear dimensionality reduction. So, autoencoders find use in nonlinear dimensionality reduction right, but can also be used in generative models. Right. Some particular examples. So, some examples which we will briefly discuss include variational autoencoders, VAEs, right, wherein you are trying to learn the distribution of data, and denoising autoencoders, right. Many times there is noise in your engineering data or signal and you want to get rid of that noise. So, that is the action of denoising. So, whether you want to learn the underlying distribution or you want to engage in nonlinear dimensionality reduction, wherein you go from a large set of features, right, that is the feature space to a fewer set of combined features, which is a latent space, then you can use autoencoders. Now, you may remember that we had discussed principal component analysis, that is a linear dimensionality reduction technique, and if you want to do dimensionality reduction, right, go from a feature space to the latent space, then you need to use an autoencoder, right. So, this is the flow of data through an autoencoder. So, from the feature space to the latent space and back to the feature space. So, this is where the dimensionality reduction happens, right, because the latent space has number of dimensions much lower than the dimension of the feature space. So, let us say there are p features here, right. So, here you can have L features, and of course, L is much lower than P, and when you go back from the latent space to the feature space, this is where your reconstruction of the data occurs. Okay. So, depending on the type of architecture that we consider here, right, and the kind of loss functions we are using, we can have variational autoencoders and denoising autoencoders, and this is something that we will try to delve very briefly because of the lack of time in this introductory course. The next type of neural network that I want to introduce is called a generative adversarial network. known in short as a GAN, GAN or GAN. Just like there were two sets of neural networks in the autoencoder which included the encoder and the decoder, here again you have two sets of neural networks. One is called a generator and the other is called a discriminator. So, a GAN involves two neural networks or two sets of neural networks called the generator and the discriminator. Okay. Just like there were different roles for the encoder and the decoder in an autoencoder, here as well in a GAN the roles of the generator and the discriminator are different, and you can sort of guess from the names what the roles are. A generator tries to generate new data, right. So, it is used in generative models, and a discriminator tries to see whether the data is genuine or it is fake, and these generators, the generator and the discriminator, they sort of fight against each other during the training and they become really good. The generator becomes good at generating new data, the discriminator becomes good at detecting fake data, and thereby you are able to only generate samples that really resemble the training distribution. Okay. So, through the use of the generator and the discriminator, GANs enable data generation and thus find use in data augmentation and generative models, whether it is for text or images and so on. Okay, so that is GANs, and finally I want to introduce you to graph neural networks, which are particularly important in things like physical chemistry and material science, because you can represent a molecule or a material as a network where there are interconnections between the atoms and these are joined together by bonds. So, the next thing we want to do is a graph neural network. Or a GNN. So, in a graph neural network, what happens is the GNN involves neural network that operate over graph structures. Okay. And these are also called as message passing neural networks. MPNNs. So, GNNs or MPNNs essentially operate on graphs. So, there is a branch of mathematics which is called graph theory, and in graph theory you deal with structures known as graphs, right. Essentially, if you look for example at a molecule, right, a molecule like methane, methane is CH4 and this is called a graph because you have nodes and you have edges. So, these are called nodes and these are called edges, right. I am taking the example of a molecule, right. So, this is a molecule of methane. So, methane is natural gas which is used as fuel in various vehicles. So, methane is CH4, one atom of carbon which is C and 4 atoms of hydrogen, right, these together form methane, and to someone working in graph theory, right, this is just a collection of nodes and edges. So, graph is a collection of entities known as nodes and edges. So, the edges basically connect the nodes together, and as you can see in fields like chemistry and materials where you have molecules and bonds and atoms, this is going to be very important. The other area where graph neural networks they find use is in social networks, right. So, if you have things like Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or X, wherein people are connected with each other, again you can think of it as a graph, right. So, every person is a node and then the edges represent followers, right. If you are following someone, you are connected through an edge. If you are not, then you are not connected with them, and you can have directionality in a graph and so on and so forth. One final area where graph neural networks are useful is knowledge networks, right. So, you know that the knowledge can be also represented as graphs, and there are relationships between various concepts and topics. So, that is again an area which is gaining a lot of attention. So, that is knowledge graphs. So, these graph neural networks GNNs, they find use in machine learnable representations of molecules, materials, social networks, and knowledge graphs. Right, and there are some variants of graph neural networks, and at this point it will be good to mention some of these variants. So, there are some variants of graph neural networks based on how messages are passed between these nodes, right. So, if you look at the other name that is given to graph neural networks, that is message passing neural networks, that is because signals are passed in between these nodes through these edges. So, this carbon, right, which is the central atom, will get messages from these nearest neighbors, right. So, you can have nearest neighbors. So, in this molecule there is only nearest neighbors, but you can imagine that as the network grows, you consider larger molecules or you consider social networks, further and further nodes, right, can be considered as neighbors, right, nearest neighbors, next nearest neighbors and so on. So, how messages are passed between these neighbors and the central node, right, that leads to variants of neural networks, and some of these neural networks, these are of course based on what kind of operations are used to update the node weights, and these can either be graph convolutional networks, where the features of the node are updated using convolutions of the neighboring features of the neighboring node. So, that is GCNs here, not GNNs, graph convolutional networks, and the other type is called graph attention networks. These are also called GANs unfortunately, but you know that there is another type of GAN also, which is a generative adversarial network. So, depending on the context, it could either be referring to a generative adversarial network or a graph attention network. Now, this attention is basically the same concept that appeared when we discussed about transformers, right, how each sort of piece of word in a paragraph of text is related to each other through these queries, keys and values which will come up. So, in the same manner here the weights of the nodes, right, are updated based on the weights of the neighbors. So, here there are 4 neighbors and these updates are based on the concept of attention, which we will cover in a little bit of detail in this course. So, this concludes our discussion of the various types of neural networks. As you saw, we considered 7 different types and these are very important in the study of neural networks and deep learning for various core engineering application areas. So, now what we will do is we will go forward and study the mathematics of a simple feed forward neural network where we will see how the output, right, the target variable is related to the set of input features, and for this example we will use the same network that we considered in the previous lecture with 4 features and 1 hidden layer with 5 nodes. So, let us go ahead and reconstruct that neural network here. So, if you remember, we had 4 different features. So, let us go ahead and draw that. We will do it quickly here since we had already done this once in the previous lecture. So, you have 4 features x1, x2, x3 and x4, and then you have this hidden layer, and this hidden layers has 5 nodes. The superscript is reflecting the layer number and the subscript is representing the node number in that layer. So, Z2 means it is the second node, Z3 is the third node and the superscript represents the layer number. So, then you have Z4 2 and Z5 2, and you know already that there is only one output that we are predicting in this feed forward neural network. Of course, you can draw all these arrows here and I leave it up to you to complete the rest of the arrows. We have already done it, but suffices to say that each of these is connected to every node in the next layer. So, I am drawing the connections for the first 2 features x1, x2, and you can do the same for the next set of features x3 and x4. Now, as you can see, the values of all the nodes feeding into a given node are weighted by separate weights and added with a bias term first. Okay, so, what you do first is the values of all the nodes feeding into a given node. So, let us consider an example node. So, this node here Z12 is going to be fed by x1, by x2, by x3 as well as by x4. Okay, let us use this particular color to represent that. So, x1 is feeding Z12, x2 is also feeding Z12, x3 is also feeding Z12 and x4 is also feeding Z12. So, this x1, x2, x3, x4 they are weighted by separate weights and also then added with a bias term, right. After you do this, then the output is acted upon by a nonlinear activation function. So, after this a nonlinear activation function is applied before the value of the node is finalized, right. In this case, we are trying to finalize the value of the node Z12, right. So, how is the value of that node finalized? Now, in mathematical notation, let us try to write this. So, basically if you consider the lth node in the second layer. So, we are trying to write the value of the lth node in the second layer. You already know that we are using superscripts for the layer number. So, superscript is the layer number and your subscript is basically the node number or the node index. So, here we are trying to write the value of the lth node in the second layer. Now, like we said, a nonlinear activation function is applied right before the value of the node is finalized. So, this nonlinear function, let us denote it by g. So, this has to act upon the value of whatever these features were weighted by different coefficients. So, you have x1, x2, x3, x4, they will be weighted by different coefficients added together, then a bias term will be added and then the nonlinear activation function will be added. So, let us write down these terms. So, you will have a bias term that is feeding into this particular node here. So, we are this is the bias term that is feeding into the lth node in the second layer, right, plus you need to write down the linear combination of the features in the previous layer. So, in general we will have p features, right. So, we have taken the example of 4 features, but in general there will be p features. So, what we need to do is each of these features, like we said, will be weighted by a different number. So, let us denote that number as w l j. So, that is the weight that is multiplying the jth feature as it feeds into the lth node in the next layer. So, that will be called WLJ1 times xj. Okay. So, now to explain this, essentially let us use a different color. So, essentially this here is the bias term and these are the weights and these are the feature values. And finally, g is the nonlinear activation function that we were discussing. So, g represents the nonlinear activation function. So, to formalize whatever we have studied right now, let us write down the notation. So, as per the notation, L represents the index for the nodes in the hidden layer. Okay, so, that is what L is. Then ZL superscript 2 which is the left hand side here, and you can see that these represent the values of the nodes in this second layer. In our case, the first layer is the input layer, the second layer is the first and only hidden layer, right, and the third layer is the output layer. So, whenever we are using superscript 2, we are referring to the second layer, which is the hidden layer in our case. So, ZL2 represents the value of the lth node in the second layer, which in our case is the hidden layer. Then g of z is basically the nonlinear activation function, and there are various choices of activation functions. You have typical sigmoid activation functions, then you have softmax activation functions in case you are working for a multi-class classification problem. You can have a tanh activation function, or there is other more linearized functions like a rectified linear unit and so on. So, we will study about the various types of activation functions in one of the future lectures. And this WLJK, right, that is an important piece here. This is the weight, right. So, it is a multiplicative factor or a weight for node J in layer K as it feeds to node L in the next layer, right. So, in our case we were writing down the value of the node in the second layer. So, the weights will be for all the nodes in the previous layer. The bias will also come from the previous layer, that is why in the superscript you are seeing 1 here instead of 2. Okay. So, as per the notation, WLJK is the weight for node J in layer K as it feeds to node L in the next layer, and finally your BLK is the bias term that feeds into node L in layer K. Okay. Or feeds, to be more precise, we should say it feeds into node layer in the layer after layer K. Okay. So, with this we come to the end of this particular lecture. We have taken some time to write down the notation, right, mathematical notation in terms of how you can write the values of the nodes in the hidden layer for a simple feed forward neural network having 4 features and 5 nodes in the hidden layer. In the next class we will discuss how we can write down the value of the output layer, and with the mathematics that results we will then discuss how we can train the neural network, obtain the weights and the biases, and go on to more complicated concepts in the field of deep learning. Thank you very much for joining today. I hope you learned something new today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.